The kind of person you are isn't welcome here. Too loud. You'd better take your money somewhere else." The bar owner sniffed derisively, pointing toward the door. Jax McAllister, a black ex-SEAL just discharged from service, stood silently, his beer still untouched. He hadn't said a word, hadn't caused a stir. He just sat there, quietly observing. "Too loud?" Jax finally spoke, his voice low and even. "I haven't even finished my first drink yet." The bar owner gestured sharply toward the door, resolute. "Get out, before I have to throw you out." The next afternoon, as the bar was preparing for the peak of happy hour, the front door swung open. Not one, but 12 men walked in with the same imposing presence as Jax. Impossible to mistake. Sitting in a corner near the window, Jax McAllister lowered his head slightly, his muscular hand resting on the freshly poured beer, the white foam still rippling. He didn't drink, nor did he look around. He just sat there, quiet, motionless, like a tree that had weathered the storm. The black man, no one in the bar knew, had once been a member of SEAL Team 6, had infiltrated the most dangerous war zones, had bitten back pain after losing comrades beside him. 15 years of service in the harshest conditions now compacted into a simple appearance. Jeans, a t-shirt, a frayed cap, and cold steel-gray eyes. Sharp enough to reflect every movement around him. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He wasn't here to stand out. Jax had come only to do what many other veterans long for. To find a place where he could be silent. Not scrutinized, not seen as something to be wary of. But even that silence, with a black ex-soldier sitting quietly, became a luxury. Across the counter, Frank Delaney, the bar owner, a large white man with a beer belly, his eyes always ready to be suspicious, had been watching Jax since the moment he walked through the door. Frank didn't need a reason. To him, people like Jax, black, silent, sharp-eyed, were never regulars, but potential threats. Frank stepped away from the counter, his heavy boots pounding on the wooden floor, making the murmurs of the other customers stop in an instant. He walked over, no smile, no question, standing before Jax like a judge with no courtroom. His breath reeked of bourbon and stale cigar smoke. Jax looked up, his gaze as calm as a winter's surface. But Frank didn't stop. His face was more twisted by prejudice than age, and then he uttered the words that the entire bar could hear. "The kind of person you are isn't welcome here." The air in the bar suddenly thickened. Conversations fell silent, like coins dropping to the floor. No one spoke, but many eyes began to sneak glances toward the corner table, where Jax still sat, unmoving. The words needed no explanation. Not because Jax was drunk. Not because he raised his voice. Not because he had violated any rules. Simply put, he didn't have the right face for the space Frank wanted to keep clean. A black man, silent, simply dressed, with cold eyes sitting in a vigilant posture. To Frank, that was a sign of trouble. Jax lifted his beer, not to drink, but as an act of steadying his breath. He knew people like Frank. He had seen them on the front lines, in government, in the legal system, even in the moments when his comrades were treated like dirt, despite having laid down their lives for the flag. He knew that if he reacted, everyone would say, "See, they're always like that." But if he stayed silent, not a single person would speak for him. Only the unfinished beer, and his gray eyes never leaving Frank's stiff face, as if memorizing every detail, every sound, every word, for another time, another way, to restore justice. Because when a SEAL stays silent, it doesn't mean surrender. It may only be silence before the storm. Jax remained in that position, his hand resting casually on the beer glass, his eyes unblinking. He sat upright, neither slouched nor tense, but there was something off. Not because Jax did anything, but because he did nothing at all. His silence had no place in Frank Delaney's world. Frank was used to loud customers, the drunk tourists, the fishermen shouting in each other's ears, the mechanics pounding down drinks from late afternoon into the night. But Jax's silence, calm, sober, unblended, made Frank feel watched. To Frank, the black man sitting in the corner felt like a piece of metal quietly placed into his furnace, and he couldn't know when it might explode. He took a step forward, deliberately stomping his shoe on the wooden floor as if to get attention. A few customers glanced over, but no one spoke. Just like before, they were used to Frank warning strangers. "I run this place, and a soldier like you only brings trouble." Frank spat out each word as if carving it into the bar's wooden walls. But Jax didn't say anything. He just tilted his head slightly, his eyes, ash gray, deep and sharp, locked onto the man trying to assert power through volume. And in that moment, Frank lost his composure. Not because Jax threatened him, but because there was no fear in those eyes. Frank was born in Port City, in a family that valued tradition. His father had run this bar since the Korean War, when a sign once hung, "No service for colored people after 10 p.m." Though the sign had been taken down in the 80s, the belief in maintaining order through racial control still lingered in Frank's mind. He'd never served in the military, but he liked to display the American flag behind the bar and tell people that his father had been artillery. In Frank's mind, supporting veterans meant hanging flags and offering holiday discounts, not accepting a casually dressed black man sitting quietly and needing no direction. Jax, with that calmness, struck directly at Frank's most fragile spot, the fear of losing control. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Frank slammed his hand on the table, causing the beer glass to tremble. A few customers flinched, glanced over, then quickly lowered their heads as if nothing had happened. Jax blinked slowly, as if confirming that the situation had gone beyond a mere misunderstanding. "You're silent as if you're watching something, or are you planning to do something?" Frank hissed, his voice no longer under control. Jax exhaled softly. At this point, he knew Frank didn't care about the truth. He was looking for a reason to justify his prejudice, and when a white man has the authority to command in a closed space, and the one being commanded is a black man, reason is never important. "I'm just drinking beer," Jax replied, his voice so soft that people had to strain to hear, and thinking about things I never say out loud. The answer wasn't harsh, but to Frank, it felt like a slap without sound. Frank took a half-step back, then shouted, not at Jax, but at the silent bar that was watching. "This guy makes me and the customers uncomfortable. I have the right to refuse service to anyone. That's the law." Jax nodded slightly. "And I have the right to leave, right?" He stood up slowly, adjusted his chair, still keeping his hand on the beer glass, even if it was just a redundant gesture. The beer remained untouched, but the dignity had been trampled. Not because of an action, but because of a gaze deemed threatening just because it wasn't looking down. Jax's silence, the self-control not needing to be demonstrated, was something Frank couldn't comprehend. And like all those weak-minded individuals who fear what they can't control, Frank chose the simplest way, to kick him out. Jax walked past Frank without looking back, but that gaze, ash gray, had carved something into the bar's atmosphere that no one dared name. A warning, a quiet endurance, and something was about to return. Jax left the salty goal in silence, his footsteps heavy but steady, as if walking through an invisible minefield where every look, every word behind him was a ticking time bomb. He didn't look back, didn't throw a single word at Frank Delaney, not because he was weak, but because he was far too familiar with this kind of battlefield. A battlefield where dignity is tested, not by bullets, but by glances. The faded jeans brushed past each dim light, the gray t-shirt damp with sweat from the suffocating atmosphere of the bar. The old baseball cap shaded half his face, not to hide, but to avoid confronting eyes that didn't need words to say, "You don't belong here." No one in town knew that the man, who had just been kicked out of the bar like a troublemaker, had once led a small unit through sleepless nights in operations in Fallujah, had dragged a dying comrade from a hail of gunfire in Somalia, and had twice cheated death in a raid on Kunar Valley, Afghanistan, when helicopters couldn't reach them, and the entire team had to walk 17 kilometers to escape. No one could see the long, raised scar near his left shoulder, caused by a shell fragment when he threw himself in front of a younger soldier who had called him a hero just minutes before dying from blood loss. No one knew that when that wound was stitched up in a field hospital, Jax didn't make a sound, not because it didn't hurt, but because he understood that personal pain didn't matter more than the mission. In the battlefield, Jax had carried a rifle, a GPS, the responsibility of life and death. And now, he only carried the gait of a man who had given up everything, except his pride. Under the streetlights, his shadow stretched long across the rough cement of the dock, where the sound of waves seemed to whisper echoes from the past. Each step was a reverberation of a soldier's life, now looked upon by society as though he was the problem. We were taught to observe. Now I'm kicked out of a bar just for observing too closely, Jax thought bitterly, his inner voice sharp and cold. In Fallujah, people looked into those eyes and called them the eyes of a commander. In Port City, a white bar owner looked at them and said, "That's a scary look." Frank Delaney didn't know what Jax had witnessed. He didn't know how Jax had once had to keep his back straight while delivering the news to a mother in Alabama that her son wouldn't be coming home, because Jax was the last one to see him alive. Frank didn't see the nights Jax sat alone, outside the rear camp, gripping his folding knife just to stay awake amidst the nightmare of PTSD. Frank also never knew that it was Jax's timely decision that saved a small forward base at the Pakistan border from being bombed that night. A decision, unknown, uncelebrated, but that saved the lives of 18 soldiers. But in Port City, all Frank saw was a black man sitting silently in his bar. Frank, still standing inside the bar, watched through the window as Jax's silhouette slowly faded into the salty mist. Inside him was a twisted sense of satisfaction, like restoring order, as if he had just gotten rid of a dangerous man. But Frank didn't know he had made the biggest mistake of his life, because he hadn't kicked out a drunk, a troublemaker, or a broke customer. He had kicked out a soldier, a man who had been willing to die for a country that now treated him like he didn't belong. And the worst part? Jax wasn't walking alone. Even without a gun in his hand, even without a uniform, he was still part of a team, and that team never left anyone behind. The words, "You just shot yourself in the foot," still echoed in the air as Jax walked out of the bar, leaving behind a heavy silence, where the lights were no longer warm enough to chase away the coldness between people. Frank stood still for a moment after Jax disappeared from view. No one spoke, no one laughed along or applauded in agreement as he had expected. The power Frank boasted about. The power to pick and choose customers, to decide who deserved to be present, suddenly felt exposed. It was as though he had shouted something no one in the bar wanted to hear anymore. But as usual, Frank still justified himself. "I did the right thing. That guy's got problems. Not like a regular customer. Doesn't look at me like normal people do. That's a look of trouble." In Frank's mind, prejudice wasn't a mistake. It was instinct. And when people call racism by a legal name like instinct, they can convince themselves that every decision they make is justified, even if that decision destroys the dignity of a person. Meanwhile, Jax didn't head straight to his room. He turned onto the road leading to the beach, where an old concrete fence ran along the water's edge, its patches of rust and dark cracks still visible from past storms. He leaned against it, his hand resting on the cold concrete, feeling the salt eat away at the surface like time-eroding trust. From there, he could see the dim lights of the salty gull flickering in the distance. That small bar, a place most people saw as just a pit stop, had become for Jax a symbol of what he had been avoiding ever since his discharge, the invisibility of a black soldier in civilian life. He pulled his phone from his back pocket, his left hand trembling slightly, not from anger, but from the memories crashing in like a big wave. His white teammates were welcomed at the airport with flags and flowers, while he was thoroughly searched like a suspect. The rejecting looks of recruiters when they saw veteran African American on his resume. Strangers casually bringing up the military only to look at him and ask, "Are you really a SEAL? You don't look like one of them." Jax opened a secure app that he and his old SEAL team members had used during special ops. Group name, Ghost Pack. In it were those who had swum silently through Karachi Harbor, who had lurked in the jungles of Niger, who had risked their lives rescuing hostages in IS-occupied towns. They didn't need to know where he was, didn't need a reason, just a signal. Jax typed slowly. Salty Gull, Port City, owner Frank Delaney, refused service. Reason, black soldier, no drinking, no trouble, kicked out while sitting quietly. FYI only, no need for a reply. He paused for a second, then hit send. It was just a notification. No cry for help, no expectation of action, just a way not to feel alone in the silence. Jack slid the phone back into his pocket, his eyes still fixed on the distance, where the sea and sky merged into a thick blackness. The wind hit his face, sharp enough to reach his bones, but the cold inside him was even deeper. He had kept silent when his friends faced discrimination abroad. He had ignored the casually racist comments in the base. He had swallowed his anger when he was given harder, more dangerous assignments, because people thought he was used to taking it. But this time was different, not because of the bar, not because of Frank, but because of that look that judged him as the problem, coming from the very place that should have been a haven after battle, a wound that doesn't bleed, an insult without words, and a storm silently forming, from a simple message, from a silence that could no longer be accepted. And then the screen went dark. Jax slipped the phone back into his pocket, his hand tightening as if holding on to something inside him that wanted to break free. He stood there for a moment, his back against the rough concrete fence, his eyes gazing out at the black water, as dark as his inner turmoil. The sky was cloudless. The world seemed to hold its breath with him. To an outsider, the message he had just sent was nothing more than a few simple characters. No emotion, no accusations, no pleas. But to those who had lived and almost died with Jax, it was a red alert, a silent alarm. Across the country, in a small town in North Carolina, Logan Reaper Rhodes, senior chief petty officer of Ghost Pack, was cleaning his shotgun in the garage when his wristwatch vibrated lightly. The message appeared, along with the silver skull icon that the whole team recognized instantly. He stopped. No need to read it twice, no need to ask what happened. Because just 3 words, black soldier, in that context, were more than enough to ignite the fire. Reaper opened another internal group, one that only those who had fought alongside him for 8 years could join. There were no long introductions, just a brief line, the tone still like when they were on the control tower radio. Jax. Kicked out in Port City, Salty Gull, discrimination, meet at rally point. Then Reaper stood up, strapped his belt tight, pulled on his jacket, quietly closed the garage door, and stepped outside as if a gust of wind had just shifted direction. Almost simultaneously across other states, from Colorado to Georgia, from Illinois to Florida, similar signals appeared. No one needed to ask why. No one needed the details. Men named Tank, Doc, Viper, Smoke, Bricks, Twitch, Maddox, one by one, they put down their beers, turned off the games, left their dinners, or interrupted dates, preparing for an unscheduled reunion. Because for Ghost Pack, when one of their own is disrespected, it's no longer a personal matter. Meanwhile, in Port City, the Salty Gull bar remained quiet as if nothing had ever happened. Frank Delaney stood behind the bar, wiping glasses with an old cloth, his eyes still glancing at the door every time a customer entered. No one knew, not even Frank, that he had just become the center of a chain of actions he could never have imagined, because he had never thought that a silent, threatening message could shake the very power structure he had built. Frank kept repeating to himself the words he had harshly thrown at Jax. I run this place. He believed in that. Believed in the right of a white man to choose who he served, based on personal biases, but legitimized under the guise of keeping order. Frank had proudly claimed to support the military, with a big flag in front of the door and a photo of his grandfather in uniform hanging behind the bar. But that support never went deeper than the paint. It was never enough to realize that a soldier doesn't need a flag hanging high. They need respect when they walk through the door. And now, because of that lack of respect, Frank was about to face something he couldn't control. A team stepping out of hell, carrying discipline, loyalty, and a lesson he would never forget. On the overnight flight to Port City, Reaper sat still in the back row, his eyes closed but not sleeping. In his hand was the phone still open to Jax's message. No reply. No okay. No we're on our way. Just action. No promises. Because when someone like Jax, quiet, patient, always looking out for his brothers, has to hit send on a message like that, it's no longer a small matter. At a roadside diner less than 150 miles from Port City, Tank, standing over 6 feet 3 inches, with shoulders as wide as a truck door, folded up the map and said to Doc, "How long to get there?" Doc checked his watch, then looked back at the map. Less than 4 hours, if there are no delays. Tank nodded, a slight grin tugging at his lips. Good, we're not here to drink beer. We're here to teach the meaning of respect. Frank Delaney had no idea that the following morning, while he was leisurely making coffee behind the bar, muttering a list of ingredients to restock for the new week, a silent wave was quietly heading toward Port City just a few blocks away. No sirens, no police escort, no protest banners or angry crowds, but there was something far more terrifying than all of that combined. The quiet of 12 men walking in unison, carrying with them both the discipline of the military and the silence of wounded pride. 3 plain black Dodge Sprinter vans stopped simultaneously in front of the Salty Gull, the tires lightly crunching on the damp pavement from the still settling morning dew. The doors opened, sharp, without a sound. Figures stepped out, tall, solid, not in uniform, but unmistakably carrying the aura of those who had stared death in the face and walked away, whole, but changed forever. They didn't speak a word, no smiles, no nods of courtesy. They didn't need to. Reaper, Logan Rhodes, led the way, just as he had when commanding Ghost Pack in Kandahar. Leather jacket, dark jeans, sunglasses hiding eyes sharp as knives, but unable to conceal the presence of a man who had made life-and-death decisions in less than 3 seconds. Behind him was Tank, a living wall, taller than everyone else by nearly a head, his biceps bulging under the faded hoodie. To his right was Doc, the man who had saved Jax from death with a piece of gauze smaller than a thumb, holding an old medical bag, but inside it were all the details he had gathered about Frank Delaney, Salty Gull, and his shady business history. The rest, Bricks, Smoke, Twitch, Viper, Maddox, Hawk, Echo, Razor, and Steel, each carried a code name, a past, a pain, and a reason that no one needed to repeat. Inside the bar, Frank looked through the window when he saw the first van pull up. His initial unease was instinctive, but it quickly turned into a chill that ran down his spine when the door opened, and he saw faces that weren't tourists nor locals he'd ever seen. Their eyes, calm yet piercing, stripped away the layers of concealment Frank had built. It was as if they saw through something Frank didn't dare name since last night. The cowardice dressed as power. They entered the bar like a special ops team just finishing a mission. Not too fast, not too slow, not a single step out of sync. No one needed to shout. No one needed to give orders, because their silence was heavier than any threat. Reaper stopped right in front of the bar, less than 2 meters from Frank. The others fanned out around the room, each picking a spot, not sitting down, not pulling out their phones, not showing any discomfort. They stood as if each chair, each post, each maritime map on the wall was a strategic position in a tactical exercise they had rehearsed hundreds of times. Frank cleared his throat and spoke in a trembling voice. What can I do for you? This is a bar. We open at 11, but—" Reaper removed his sunglasses. His black eyes were deep, unsettlingly still. "I don't need beer, I need you." His voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, but every word was forged from cold steel. Frank took half a step back, his hand tracing the edge of the bar, as if searching for something to hold on to. I didn't do anything wrong. If this is about last night, I was just following security procedures. This is my place. I have the right." His voice trailed off as Reaper simply tilted his head. "No one said you don't have the right, but rights don't exempt you from consequences." In the corner of the bar, Tank walked toward the old guitar hanging on the wall, his finger gently brushing the dust as though by accident. But in that moment, Frank realized these men weren't here just to cause trouble. They were calculating, organized, synchronized, like a real military unit. The silence stretched so long that even the sound of the coffee machine behind him felt too loud. Frank tried to laugh, a crooked smile. "I support the military. I have the American flag right in front of the door." Reaper smiled slightly. His first smile of the morning, but it held no warmth. A flag means nothing if the person hanging it is afraid to look into the eyes of the ones who protected it. Far away, Jax was stepping out of the temporary room he had rented, less than 6 blocks from the bar. He didn't know that a team in plain clothes had arrived because of him. He only knew that this morning, when he woke up, there was a familiar feeling in his chest, just like the night before a raid, when he knew something is about to change. Just walking was enough to make the whole street feel different, not because of the sound, not because of weapons, but because of the stride of 12 men who had been forged in the same crucible, silent, uniform, and never retreating. Senior Chief Logan Reaper Rhodes didn't need to tell anyone where to go or what to do. The men behind him, the wolves who had survived in lands that weren't even named on the map, understood the workings of a real SEAL team too well. Consensus wasn't in the words spoken. It was in the way their eyes moved, how their shoulders shifted slightly, how their hands instinctively clenched when the atmosphere became suspicious. The 3 vans carried no cargo. They carried memories, honor, and a reason that couldn't be ignored. One of their brothers, Jerome Jax McAllister, had just been spit on by someone who had never known what sacrifice was. Frank Delaney, watching through the window, now understood. These weren't big, tough guys. This was a tactical unit. No noise, no rush. But when they walked through the door, he felt like each step they took was stamping into his heart. Cold, steady, and without escape. Reaper entered first, empty-handed, carrying nothing but a terrifying stillness. The stillness of someone who had given the command to advance under conditions where even a scream couldn't save anyone. And this time, he wasn't there to give orders. He was there to restore order. Behind him were Tank, Doc, Bricks, Viper, and the rest, each stepping in as if they belonged there. But not in the homecoming way. They walked in like witnesses to a place that once claimed to be decent, but was now rotten to its very foundations. Frank was sweating. His hand clutched the edge of the bar like an anchor in a storm he couldn't see the end of. Trying to force a smile, he weakly spoke. "I don't know. Are you guys friends of the guy from last night?" Reaper didn't answer. He just looked. His gaze calm, as flat as still water before an undercurrent rises. Then, slowly, he removed his sunglasses, folding them with 2 fingers and placing them on the bar as if marking a boundary. Doc moved behind, opening a small leather bag. Not to get gauze, but to pull out an iPad, containing all the files he'd prepared. The bar's business license, online posts, images from security cameras at the street corner, and Frank Delaney's full name, along with a history of discrimination, complaints from 2017 to 2023. Frank took half a step back, his mouth dry. "I don't have a problem with race. I was just following the security protocols. I felt he didn't fit the vibe of the bar." Tank snorted softly from behind, low, heavy, like the growl of an animal still asleep, not yet awake. Reaper still didn't say much. His voice was low and precise, like a radio command in enemy territory. "Do you know who Jax is?" Frank swallowed hard, shaking his head. "He's the guy who pulled 4 people out of a collapsed building in Kunduz, one of whom was a white guy. Didn't ask their names, didn't care about party lines, just because they were people. Meanwhile, last night, you saw a black man sitting quietly drinking a beer and decided he was the problem." Reaper paused. The air conditioning above hummed faintly, as if reminding everyone of the growing, suffocating atmosphere. "We didn't come to make a scene. None of us here need to teach you with our fists, but we'll teach you something you've never understood. Respect isn't in the slogans hung on the door. It's in how you treat people when no one's forcing you to be kind." Outside, a few passers-by stopped. They didn't know what was going on. They just saw a group of silent men occupying the entire bar space as if it had never belonged to anyone else. Inside, Frank began to tremble. He had once thought he was just following the law. But now, the law couldn't save him from the feeling of being exposed. No one yelled, no one threatened, but each gaze from the Ghost Pack team seemed to strip away the thick layers Frank had built, and underneath there was only cowardice. Reaper didn't take his eyes off Frank. His voice was quiet, but it hit the listener's mind like an alarm going off in their soul. "You kicked out the wrong man. And now, you'll make it right." Frank, preparing to open the door to step outside for his morning cigarette, a routine he followed every day, stood frozen as if turned to stone when he saw the 3 black vans pull up simultaneously in front of the bar. He barely had time to glance at the figures stepping out before his heart skipped a beat, a primal survival reflex kicking in. Something wasn't right. Not right at all. Trying to pull himself together, Frank adjusted his shirt, wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and opened the door, forcing a strained smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. How can I help you?" No one answered. They just stood there, 12 men, whose silence seemed to lower the bar's atmospheric pressure by 10 units. No wind, no laughter, no unnecessary movement. They didn't need to respond. Their presence was the answer. Reaper was the first to step forward. Each of his steps was like a drumbeat echoing on the old wooden floor of the bar. The others fanned out smoothly but decisively, forming an invisible arc that completely blocked the entrance in the bar, making Frank feel surrounded, not by weapons but by the truth. Frank began to sweat despite the air conditioning running steadily. He glanced to the left, Tank, glanced to the right, Doc. Each one stood like an immovable pillar, turning the cramped space of the bar into a trial that didn't need a judge, didn't need witnesses, because all the evidence was already standing there. "Are you Frank Delaney?" Reaper asked, his voice low and slow, like each word had been forged in fire. Yes, I'm the owner here." Frank stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an invisible escape. "Then let's speak plainly." Reaper cut him off, not raising his voice but with a tone that made even the people sitting in the nearby cafe across the street glance over. The air thickened. Frank felt like he had just inhaled something heavier than oxygen. It pressed on his chest, making his heart race and sweat trickle down his spine. "Last night, you kicked a man out of this bar, a former SEAL, a man who fought, bled, and sacrificed time and health for the flag you have hanging on the front of this bar." Reaper paused for a beat, letting the words sink into the cracks of the wooden floor. "And you kicked him out for what? His skin color? For the fact that he dared to look you in the eye without lowering his head?" Frank tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. I didn't know who he was. I just thought. Tank took half a step forward, just one step. He said nothing, but the floorboards creaked under his heavy boots like a hammer strike. Frank stepped back, his hand almost trembling as it touched the bar. "What do you think?" Reaper asked again, his voice lower, sharper, like a knife's edge grazing skin. "You thought a black man, sitting quietly drinking beer in his own bar, was a threat?" "No, not exactly," Frank stammered, but fell silent when the entire Ghost Pack's gaze fell upon him like a wall. Doc, standing behind, opened the iPad, turning the screen so Frank could see. A traffic camera at the street corner had captured the entire scene. Jax entering the bar, sitting alone, ordering a beer. Another clip showed Frank approaching, speaking harshly, and Jax leaving. "This is him causing trouble?" Doc asked softly. Frank was speechless, his lips pressed together as if trying to hold back tears, but not a tears of regret. No, it was fear. Viper, the man who had lost an eye during an operation in Marawi, stepped closer to Frank. He didn't speak, just rolled up his sleeve to reveal an old tattoo. No one left behind. Frank looked at the tattoo, then looked around. Every eye in the bar, every small movement, everything seemed to say the same thing. "You left one behind, and we won't let that go." Reaper finally spoke, slowly, as if giving him one last chance. "You have two choices. One, pretend this never happened, and let the name Salty Gull go on the blacklist of every soldier who's ever worn this country's uniform. Two, you make it right, publicly, the right way, starting with a straight apology to Jax." Frank swallowed hard. His eyes dropped to the floor as if searching for a hole to crawl into. But there was no escape. There was only one choice, one confession, and a series of actions, if he wanted to keep anything left of himself. Reaper stood motionless. He was like an unmoving monument, his voice not loud, not fast, but carrying the weight of 15 years of combat, of hundreds of orders given in which the listener never questioned. I hear you had a misunderstanding with one of our teammates, Jerome McAllister. The name was emphasized clearly, like a declaration. Frank swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, seeing 12 pairs of eyes still fixed on him. Not angry, not accusing, but full of silence that forced him to face the truth. A truth he had tried to avoid his entire life. That his actions had always been concealed under the safe excuses of power. I didn't know he was a soldier," Frank said quickly, his hands clasped in front of his stomach as if protecting himself from their gazes. "I just felt bad vibes." He sat there silently, like he was watching me, like he was judging me. A slight snort came from Tank, low, heavy, but resonant like thunder on a summer afternoon. It wasn't mocking, but a warning. The next words you speak might shatter the last bit of dignity you have left. Doc, standing to the right of Reaper, shook his head slightly, placing his hand on the counter as if presenting a battlefield report. "Bad vibes?" Doc's voice was sarcastic. "You're talking about a man who's won 2 bronze stars for saving comrades from an ambush in Haditha. A man whose military records only note from his commander is McAllister never retreats, physically or morally." Frank couldn't respond. He couldn't. The bad vibes he had mentioned were no longer an ambiguous feeling. They were now an open indictment of his prejudice. Bricks, a team member who had lost his index finger in an explosion in Syria, stepped forward. He carried nothing but a color photo from a military magazine, showing Jax carrying a young soldier through the rubble, blood staining his shirt. He raised the photo high and placed it on the counter in front of Frank. "This is the guy you felt bad vibes from?" Frank stared at the photo, silent. A strange dizziness hit him. The man he had viewed with suspicion the night before was now an image of a true hero, but not one who carried praise, only a sad and quiet endurance. Reaper crossed his arms, leaning forward, not threatening, but his presence weighed on Frank like a stone on his chest. "We didn't come here to drink. We didn't come here to argue. We came to listen. One thing only. What do you truly think about what you did?" The question had no unnecessary words, no subtle hints. It was the most bare, moral interrogation, and Frank knew, if he didn't answer with something truly right, no one here would leave as a friend. Frank took a step back, exhaling sharply. The right of the bar owner to refuse service now felt like a thin layer of paper being stripped away in the rainstorm. I think I was afraid," Frank blurted out, surprising even himself. "I don't know why. Maybe because he didn't look like a regular customer, because he didn't speak, because he's black, because I was used to seeing people like him in a different way." A wave of silence swept through the room. No one interjected. No one laughed. Because the truth, though late, was still the first step toward redemption. Reaper nodded slowly. He turned to Doctor. The medic nodded and handed over a phone. "You will call Jax, right here, no script, no pre-written words, just tell him the truth. Like a man, not a bar owner, not a white guy doing the law, but a man who was wrong, and now wants to make it right." Frank looked at the phone as if it weighed more than everything else. But he knew. This was no longer a request. It was the only test left for him to walk out of this room without losing everything. Reaper didn't preach. He didn't need to raise his voice, slam his hand on the table, or use sharp words. Just one sentence. And it fell like an axe, severing the last remnants of Frank's reason. A black man who gave his youth to this country, and you threw him out like trash." The air seemed to freeze. Frank broke into a cold sweat. His breath was shallow and out of rhythm. His face went from flushed to pale, like a man who had just been told he had terminal cancer, except this disease was called cowardice wrapped in privilege. The bouncer from last night, the big guy who had stood next to Frank, nodding and sneering as Jax left, had disappeared into the kitchen the moment the ghost pack stepped through the door. The bar now was only filled with the sound of Frank's frantic heartbeat, and the looks that didn't need loud threats to expose him. Frank tried to stand tall, but he knew he was shaking. For the first time in his life, the role of bar owner, the label of "I have the right to refuse service," felt hollow. I'm sorry," he said quietly, his eyes looking down at the floor. "I didn't know, didn't think of the consequences. I was wrong." Reaper nodded slowly, a nod not for forgiveness, but for acknowledging that Frank had finally stepped onto the first rung of the ladder to redemption. But just an apology wasn't enough. Doc placed the phone on the counter. The screen lit up, ready to dial. Reaper said, "Now you will call Jax. You'll apologize, not to us, but to him. No excuses. No beating around the bush. Don't hide behind the American flag. And when you've apologized, you'll act, to show you understand that humility isn't in words, it's in what you do." Frank swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he pressed the numbers on the screen. The connection sound beeped, each beep like the tapping of an impending verdict. On the other end of the line, a deep voice answered, "Jax here." Frank swallowed again, glancing up at the ghost pack. They didn't leave, didn't nod, didn't urge him. They just waited for him to do the right thing. "Mr. McAllister, this is Frank Delaney, owner of Salty Gull," Frank said, his voice small but steady. "Last night I treated you badly. I was wrong, completely wrong, to let prejudice override what's right. I had no reason to kick you out. I humiliated someone I should have respected." He paused for a moment. Frank swallowed the lump in his throat, then continued, "I'm sorry, from the heart. And I want you to know that this bar will never be the same again. If you allow it, I'd like to meet you and invite you back, not as a customer, but as someone this town owes an apology to." Silence. There was no immediate response from the other end. Frank thought the call would end, but then Jax's voice came through, calm, clear. "I hear your words. I don't need free drinks. I don't need you to fix your reputation. I just need you to remember that feeling of being faced with a part of yourself you've never dared admit. If you truly remember that, then no more words are needed. And I'll drop by, but not for the beer, for the people standing behind you, to remind you to never forget." The call ended. Frank placed the phone down, breathing as if he had just surfaced from the depths of the ocean. But Reaper's gaze hadn't left him, and now he stepped forward another step, closer than ever. "Now," Reaper said slowly, clearly, "you will transfer $10,000 to the Navy SEAL Foundation's Jerome McAllister Fund. Not to atone, but to remind you, the value of humility is not in your pocket. It's in knowing who you owe." Frank froze. $10,000. For a bar like Salty Gull, that wasn't a small sum. But he didn't dare object. Not after everything that had just happened. Doc stepped forward, placing the iPad in front of him. The screen opened to the donation page. "I'm here to help fill in the details, if you need," Doc said. A slight smile, but not comforting, just enough to show that every step had been calculated. Frank nodded. No more resistance. Because now he understood clearly. An apology is the beginning. But action, Now that's what measures whether remorse is real. Frank Delaney nodded silently as he heard Reaper's final demands. Not because he wanted to, but because now he understood there was no other choice if he wanted to keep even a shred of his remaining dignity. 3 demands: clear, decisive, no gray areas, call Jax and publicly apologize, inviting him back. Post a formal apology on all of the bar's social media platforms, acknowledging the discrimination that occurred and committing to change. Donate a large sum, at least $10,000, to the Navy SEAL Foundation under the name of Jerome McAllister. Not for you to atone, Reaper said slowly, but to understand that self-respect is worth more than profit, and sometimes the price of cowardice is learning how to be human again. Frank stood still. The words, no harshness, no malice, but they sank into him like acid on a wound of pride. Because Frank could no longer hold the facade of someone who was misunderstood. He had been exposed, not by rage, but by uncompromising integrity. Doc continued helping Frank complete the donation process. Each line entered on the screen felt like a carve into the personal record Frank had once painted for himself. The money was transferred, the receipt printed. Tank folded the receipt into quarters and slipped it into his jacket pocket, not to threaten, just to remember. Then Bricks pulled out his phone, facing the bar. Now for social media. Frank opened Instagram, Facebook, and Yelp apps. His hands still trembled. Reaper stared directly into his eyes. Write from your heart. If you lie, we'll know. Frank took a deep breath, then began typing. I, Frank Delaney, the owner of the Salty Gull Bar, deeply apologize to Mr. Jerome McAllister, U.S. Navy SEAL veteran. Last night I handled things poorly, making a decision based on personal prejudice, and treated a hero as a suspect. That action does not reflect the values of our community, nor the values I want to uphold. I am sorry, and I will do whatever I can to make it right. He posted the message. No edits, no hiding comments. Reaper nodded again, signaling that the first lesson had been remembered. Outside, the sun began to climb higher. A breeze from the sea blew through, making the American flag in front of the bar gently slap against the stainless steel pole, clinking softly. That flag, over the years, Frank had hung as a symbol, but now he truly understood. Not everyone who hangs the flag deserves to be called a patriot. Only when you understand the value of those who bled for it, are you truly worthy to stand beneath it. Ghost Pack didn't drink, didn't touch their glasses, didn't sit. They just stood quietly, steadily, like an invincible formation. In the next hour, the Salty Gull became a space that belonged to a group of people who didn't need weapons to take control. They didn't dominate. They redefined what it meant for a veteran to walk in and not have to bow his head. A few curious passers-by stopped at the door, seeing the tense atmosphere and the 12 men standing like pillars around the bar. They froze, then turned away, not out of fear, but because they could feel that something was unfolding in the silence. A reprimand that didn't need weapons. Tank turned to Doc, smiling lightly. Do you think Frank understands now? Doc didn't smile, just replied, he hasn't fully understood, but tonight he won't be able to sleep. Reaper stood last, quietly stepping closer to Frank, who was now standing behind the bar, like a student called to the front. He placed his hand on the counter, speaking softly, just enough for Frank to hear. Next time, when a man like Jax walks into this bar, you won't need to check his papers. Just remember that you once stood before 12 men and learned how to lower your head without losing your dignity. That's what we did today, not because Jax couldn't speak for himself, but because we want to make sure you never silence someone like him again. When Ghost Pack left the bar, No one said goodbye. No need. They left as quietly as they came, proudly, and leaving behind a tremor in every wooden board, every gaze. And Frank Delaney, the bar owner who once thought he ran this place, now stood silently, looking out the door and learning how to be human again from the beginning. When Doc, the Ghost Pack's medic, and the one who kept the finances accurate down to the last cent, led Frank Delaney into the small office behind the bar to complete the donation process, the rest of the group didn't move. They spread out across the bar like satellites quietly orbiting around a center point that was spinning in shame. No one ordered beer. No one touched a chair. No one laughed or chatted. They were just present, and their presence alone made the already heavy atmosphere feel as thick as smoke that hadn't dissipated in a silent funeral service. Tank sat by the entrance, legs crossed, hands woven together. His posture seemed relaxed, but anyone who had ever been in the military would recognize it, the waiting for orders stance. He didn't look at anyone in the bar, but his gaze seemed to pierce through the walls, warning anyone that any deviance would not have the chance to be corrected. Bricks picked a seat near the dusty DJ booth. He placed his phone on the table but didn't look at the screen. His gaze followed the back door, where Doc and Frank were talking. Not to monitor, but to affirm that everything was being watched, even without words. A middle-aged man walked in from the front door, wearing shorts, a Hawaiian shirt, and a white baseball cap, clearly a tourist. But as soon as he pushed the door open, his eyes swept across the 12 figures scattered throughout the bar. Everyone was silent. Everyone saw him, but no one stared. And in that heartbeat he understood. Not today, not here. He turned around, pushed the door open again, and left without a word. Next came an elderly couple. They stopped at the door, hesitated, and then the wife mumbled, "Strange, no one's saying anything, but it feels like ice down my spine." The husband nodded lightly, his hand resting on her shoulder, whispering, "Let's go somewhere else. This isn't just a normal bar." Indeed, Salty Gull that day was no longer just a bar. It became a sacred space, not because of religion, but because of the presence of something that had been considered outdated in this hurried world: loyalty, honor, and respect for those who have been silent their entire lives so others could speak. Inside the office, Frank Delaney sat behind his desk, the laptop open to the online donation page. On the screen was the green message: "Transaction successful, $10,000. Recipient, Navy SEAL Foundation, in honor of Jerome McAllister." Doc nodded, confirming. Then he looked at Frank for a long time, without smiling, without nodding. Just a look full of sternness and regret. "Do you know," Doc said, his voice light like a needle's prick, "if you just apologized in front of white people, it would be a way to soothe your ego. But if you do the right thing with a black man and don't need anyone to push you, then that's conscience." Frank was silent. His eyes were red. He no longer felt offended. He felt as though he had just been removed from a mask he didn't know he had been wearing for years. When the two returned to the counter, Ghost Pack remained silent. No one slammed the table. No one stood up and patted Frank on the back. They just looked once. And in that gaze, there was something Frank had never received in his life: unspoken validation. And then, like a ceremony that had concluded its rites, the team silently left the bar, each one stepping out the door that had been forced open by power, but was now opened by humility. Frank stood behind the bar, saying nothing. He just nodded gently, as if someone who had just learned how to breathe again. From the corner of the street, Reaper stopped, turning his head to look back at Salty Gull one last time. Not to check, but like a teacher looking back at a student after a major exam. He knew the silence they left behind would echo through the walls of that bar for many years. The door to the Salty Gull closed behind the final steps of Ghost Pack, and the space lingered like the echo of a moral storm that had just passed through. Frank stood still behind the bar, as if he no longer knew how to use his hands. Those hands had poured thousands of beers, directed dozens of staff, and patted regulars on the back like a commander. Yet now they trembled as they held a tiny phone. Frank took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the screen before pressing the dial button. Jerome McAllister, last number dialed. The phone rang, 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings, and then a voice sounded, low, calm, neither angry nor disdainful, like a stream flowing over stones, leaving no scratch, but enough to make the listener know that inside was a well of emotions buried long ago. "Jack's here." Frank bit his lip. There was no time to think about how to say it right. The words came out unpolished, unscripted, but they were real. For the first time, perhaps in many years, Frank spoke the truth. "Jerome, I was wrong. I didn't see you as a person. I only saw what I've been afraid of my whole life without questioning it. I have no reason, no excuses. I disrespected you, disrespected what you've done for this country. And I invite you to come back to the bar, with honor." Silence. Frank held his breath, like a man waiting for a judgment. On the other end, Jax didn't say anything for a few seconds. But in that silence, Frank heard the worst thing. Not a refusal, but the silence of someone who had become accustomed to being overlooked, and now choosing whether to believe that people can really change. Finally, Jax spoke, his voice neither cold nor warm. "I'll think about it, but not because of you, but because my brothers have spoken. And when they do that, I know sometimes the best thing a person can do is to let themselves be heard again." The call ended. Frank sat down on the floor behind the bar, still holding the phone. He didn't know if he had received forgiveness or just an opportunity to prove he deserved it. But he knew one thing. For the first time in his life, he had spoken to a man who didn't bow his head to him. But Frank couldn't raise his head to him. That evening, Frank sat alone in his office, in front of a blank sheet of paper and a fountain pen he hadn't used in years. No keyboard, no autocorrect, just paper, ink, and courage. He wrote, "Jerome, I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing to say that I know what I've done, and I'm ready to make it right. If you decide to come back to Salty Gull, I will not consider it the return of a customer. I will consider it the acceptance of someone who once entered my space in peace, only to be cast out. If that day comes, I will serve you with the hands I've learned to use again. Not to hold power, but to lay down arrogance. Frank Delaney." The letter was placed in an envelope, signed by hand, and left on the counter. Not sent by email, not posted on social media, just waiting for a hand to come, open it, and decide whether to step back into the bar. A week later, Jerome "Jax" McAllister gently pushed open the old wooden door of the Salty Gull. No one dared to breathe loudly as he entered. There was no ringing bell to announce his arrival. No familiar "good evening" from the bar. It was as if time itself paused, as if the bar knew it was about to relearn how to exist. Frank Delaney was waiting, not behind the bar, not in the office, but right in the middle of the room, where every gaze could see his every move. When Jax walked to his old table, the one where he had been thrown out just for his quiet presence, Frank said nothing. He didn't offer his hand to shake. He didn't try to make conversation. He simply walked around behind Jack's, pulled out the chair with both hands, like a servant, not the owner. That gesture, small, unassuming, was heavier than any speech Frank had ever given in his life. Frank walked back to the bar. His hands didn't shake. Not because he had overcome the fear, but because he had learned to control it through kindness. He poured Jack's a beer like it was for an honored guest. No words, no tricks. He poured it just to the edge of the glass, not a drop more, like an unspoken statement. I will never let you feel lacking. Frank placed the glass on the table with both hands. He took a step back. The bow he gave to Jack's wasn't deep, but it was low enough for a lifetime of pride to bow before the one who deserved it. The bouncer from the night before stood behind the bar, saying nothing, but the look he gave Jack's was one that knew when to keep silent and when to bow his head. He gave a small nod, not out of duty, but out of respect. Jack's nodded back, not smiling, not stiff, not cold, simply like a man acknowledging, I see. No one in the bar brought up the past, but every eye in the room showed no one had forgotten. And more than that, no one dared to repeat it. Jack's didn't sit like someone testing anyone. He sat as he once did, back straight, eyes lightly looking out the window, hands resting on the table as if measuring his own heartbeat in a world that had just shifted. He didn't laugh loudly. He didn't tell stories about Ghost Pack. He didn't boast of his exploits. He didn't mention the donation, didn't mention the apology. He didn't need to, because the victor never needs to shout. A middle-aged woman walked in with her husband, surprised at the quiet atmosphere. She glanced at Jack's, the black man sitting alone at the corner table, and quietly whispered to her husband, I used to think this place was a little conservative. Now it seems different. Her husband nodded. Maybe for the first time it's starting to be truly everyone's bar. From afar, Frank stood silently, his hand on the bar, his eyes never leaving Jack's. Not to supervise, but to learn how a man can walk into the very place that once offended him, and without using a single harsh word, still make the whole room bow its head. A few minutes later, Reaper walked in. No announcement. He didn't come to inspect, he didn't come to remind, he simply walked in, placed a hand on Jax's shoulder and squeezed lightly. No one said anything, no need to. Because the silence that day had sounded like a ceremonial gunshot fired into the sky, for a soldier who didn't need a weapon, but carried the weight of an entire team within him. Jax left the bar half an hour later, not finishing his beer. He simply placed money on the table, twice the amount, and didn't wait for change. When Frank reached out to call him back, Reaper gently shook his head. Don't. That's part of his honor. Don't touch it. From that moment on, the Salty Gull was no longer just a place for regulars. It became a place where anyone could step in, as long as they understood the respect owed to the one who had once been pushed out in silence. When the door of the Salty Gull closed behind Jerome Jax McAllister, on that quiet sunny afternoon, with no waves on the water, but deep below Port City, everything shifted. There was no media coverage, no live streams or hashtags, but just 3 days later, the story had spread throughout the harbor, from the fishermen's docks to the coffee stands by the local market, from barber shops to auto repair shops. Everyone heard it retold, each person adding a detail, each version a little different. But the focus never changed. A black soldier was kicked out of a bar for being too quiet. The next day, his whole SEAL team showed up and made everything change. No punches, no shouting, just their presence, and that was enough. The Salty Gull, from a small bar that catered to old regulars, became the most veteran-friendly bar in the country. But the change didn't come from the slogan on the glass door or the welcome veteran sign behind the bar. It came from how Frank Delaney personally pulled out a chair for a customer in a worn military jacket. How the bar staff relearned the habit of looking guests in the eye when they entered, no matter their skin color. How a white customer who once mocked the tense look of the soldier now bowed his head when he saw someone wearing military ID. No need for new rules, no need for staff training. Just one strong event, and a team quiet enough, deep enough, loyal enough to become a mirror. After that afternoon, Frank Delaney was no longer the same man. He didn't speak much, but in every action, from how he brewed coffee, wiped glasses, to how he tipped the wandering veterans, there was a silent respect that couldn't be faked. He no longer used the American flag as a decoration. Now it was folded correctly, framed next to the counter, beneath a small photo of Jack's. A candid shot of him smiling gently, eyes squinted, looking out to the sea. No caption, no explanation. When asked, Frank simply said, "The man who taught me what honor is," without needing to lecture. Port City changed. Not loudly, no protests, but people started to notice. The guys who once joked about race now hesitated before speaking. The bar owners who once proudly declared, "My customers, my rules," now lowered their voices when talking about soldiers. And those who once thought SEALs were just rich white guys playing with guns now understood one thing. SEALs are also Jerome McAllister, a black soldier who didn't need to shout, but still made the whole street fall silent. Because when you insult a black soldier, you don't just insult an individual. You challenge an entire world where loyalty doesn't stop at borders, isn't limited by uniforms, and doesn't require a certificate. That world, where every scar on the skin is a map, every silent gaze is a declaration, doesn't need weapons to act, just presence. And when a SEAL is insulted, the whole team will show up. No noise, no weapons, no banners, just to teach the world the most fundamental lesson, a lesson many have forgotten for too long. Respect is not something you give to someone deserving. Respect is something you hold, to not lose yourself. And if you ever wonder, does silence have power? Then remember that afternoon when a black soldier sat alone, drinking half a beer, not smiling, but the whole town stood still as if breathing slower. Because sometimes the strongest way to stand up is to sit down, in the very place you were pushed out, and never leave. If you think this story deserves to be shared, please like, share with the people you respect, and subscribe to the channel to never miss stories of honor, loyalty, and kindness in this age. Because sometimes the quietest people are the ones teaching the world how to treat others right.